Why do you always wear that old torn jacket? Lucas sneered, his voice sharp, cutting through the hallway air. Your dad was just a nobody, Brady added with a smirk. They laughed, cold and careless, grabbing at the jacket, pulling, tearing, trying to rip away everything Ethan held close. They were called to the principal's office, forced to face what they had done. Ethan sat there, silent but unwavering, even as they tried to force an apology from his lips. Then two black SUVs pulled up outside. A colonel stepped in, quiet and sure, his gaze silencing the room. Because sometimes honor isn't in medals or speeches. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Ethan Wells wore his father's military jacket every single day, 15 years old, with shoulders not yet grown into the faded green canvas. He still carried it like a badge of honor. The jacket was too big, swallowing him whole, but it was his. And that meant more than anything the other kids at Maplewood High School could understand. I'm Nora West, a history teacher here, and I watched it all unfold. Not just the way that jacket set Ethan apart, but the way it drew every pair of mocking eyes in the hallway like a magnet. It was early October, crisp air blowing in from the north, carrying the promise of winter. The town of Maplewood was already wrapped in scarves and thick sweaters. But Ethan never traded that jacket for warmth. He wore it because it still smelled faintly of his father's aftershave, because it held the only memory he had of Matthew Wells, a man who served quietly and died without any medals to hang in a glass case. And because in a world that measured worth by shiny things, that old jacket was proof of something real. The school was like any other small-town high school, a squat brick building, built decades ago, with an aging gym that smelled of sweat and echoes, hallways lined with faded class photos and championship banners, a place that prided itself on tradition, though it didn't always remember what tradition meant. Ethan didn't fit the mold here. His father's name wasn't on any of those trophies in the main hall. He didn't have the money to join the travel teams, or the family name to get invited to the big dances. He was just a quiet boy in an old jacket, moving through the halls like a shadow. And I think that was what bothered Lucas and his friends most. Lucas Carter, Brady Wilkes, and Chase Freeman, sons of the men who owned half of Maplewood. They walked the halls like they owned them, too. Brady with his easy grin and expensive sneakers. Chase trailing along, always laughing just a beat too late. But it was Lucas who led them. Lucas with his perfect hair and perfect teeth, who looked at Ethan's jacket and saw something he couldn't buy. Hey, Wells, Lucas said that morning as I watched from my classroom doorway. He leaned against the lockers, arms folded, that lazy smile playing on his lips. Still playing soldier with that rag. Thought you'd have grown out of dress up by now? Brady and Chase laughed, but Ethan didn't flinch. He just kept his head down, one hand resting on the patch at his shoulder, his father's old unit insignia. I felt the sting of those words like a slap, but I didn't step in. Not yet, because I'd learned that some things needed to play out. And because Ethan never asked for help. He never said a word. That was his strength, but also his burden. He would sit in my classroom, back row by the window, with that jacket pulled tight around him. His eyes were always searching past the whiteboard, past the lessons, somewhere I couldn't follow. Sometimes, I'd see him take out an old photo from his wallet, a picture of Matthew Wells, standing in a dusty field, boots laced tight, one hand resting on the barrel of his rifle. No medals on his chest, just a tired smile and the weight of someone who knew exactly why he stood there. Ethan would trace the edge of that photo with his thumb, as if the paper might disappear if he didn't hold it down. I wondered what he saw in that photo, a hero, a ghost, or just the man who had once carried him on broad shoulders, who had taught him how to stand tall when the world tried to push him down outside. The leaves rattled in the wind. Inside, the voices in the hall were hushed as the first bell rang. I watched Ethan pack up his books, shoulders hunched forward like he was bracing for a blow that never seemed to come, but it did come. Every day, Lucas made sure of it. Tell me, Wells, Lucas said later that afternoon. In the cafeteria, he leaned across the table, his voice syrup smooth but sharp as a knife. Your dad ever actually do anything? Or was he just another nobody who couldn't hack it? I was standing by the lunch line, clipboard in hand, but my heart stopped. The way Ethan froze, the way his fingers tightened around that jacket, knuckles white, but still, he said nothing, not a word. He just stood up, tray in hand, and walked away. Lucas laughed. Chase and Brady high-fived like they'd won something. And I couldn't move. I should have said something. Should have told them that medals aren't the measure of a man. That some men serve in ways no medal can ever mark. But I didn't. Not then. Because in that moment, I realized something. Ethan's silence wasn't weakness. It was his way of honoring what his father had taught him. To stand. Even when no one else stood with him. After school, I watched him leave the building alone. That jacket flapping in the cold wind. He didn't look back. He never did. But I did. I watched until he turned the corner, disappearing behind the old oak tree at the edge of the soccer field. And I promised myself if he could carry that jacket every day, I could carry this story. Because some legacies aren't written in history books. They're stitched into the seams of an old jacket, worn by a boy who refuses to forget. The next day, the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Classes went by in a blur: math, history, science, each hour marked by the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of pencils on paper. But under it all, there was a crackle, an unspoken warning that something was building just out of sight. When the final bell rang, I watched Ethan walk out of my classroom, his shoulders set, the jacket snug against the cold. I wanted to stop him, to tell him to be careful, but he was already gone, blending into the river of students headed for the doors. I gathered my papers, but my hands shook just a little, because I knew Lucas and his friends wouldn't let things lie. They never did. I stepped outside into the chill, the wind biting through my coat, and saw them: Lucas, Brady, and Chase waiting by the edge of the soccer field. The grass was still damp from the morning frost, turning the ground into a slick patchwork of mud and dead leaves. Ethan walked right into it, head down, one hand tucked into the pocket of that old jacket. He didn't see them until it was too late. "Hey, Wells!" Lucas called out, his voice low and smooth. Ethan stopped, his breath fogging in the air. Lucas stepped forward, that easy smile stretching across his face. "Why don't you take off that jacket? Let the world see you for what you really are." Brady laughed, a short, sharp bark. Chase hung back, but his eyes glimmered with the same ugly thrill. Ethan shook his head once. No, it was one word, but it landed like a stone. Lucas's smile slipped. Brady stepped in closer, grabbing at the sleeve of the jacket. "Come on, man," he sneered. "It's just a jacket. What's so special about it?" Ethan twisted away, his hands gripping the fabric tight. "It's mine," he said, voice steady. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Your dad's a nobody." Wells, he spat. "No medals, no honors, just another ghost in a uniform." I watched from a distance, my heart in my throat. I should have stepped in right then. Should have raised my voice, but I didn't. Not yet. Brady shoved Ethan hard, and he stumbled back, his feet slipping in the mud. But he didn't let go of the jacket. Lucas reached out, fingers curling into the collar, trying to rip it away. Ethan's knuckles went white, and he shoved back with everything he had. It wasn't enough. The three of them pushed him down. The breath punched out of him as he hit the cold, wet ground. For a moment, everything went still. Then Brady leaned down, his face inches from Ethan's. "Say it," he hissed. "Say you're nothing? Say your dad was nothing." Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. His lips parted just enough for me to see the truth in his eyes. He would never say it. I couldn't watch anymore. I turned and walked away, my feet moving faster than my thoughts. I didn't go to the principal's office. I didn't go to the staff room. Instead, I went straight to the dusty file room in the basement, a place most teachers never bothered with. The air was cold and smelled of old paper and forgotten memories. I flicked on the light, the bulb flickering overhead, and started digging. The records were a mess: old report cards, yellowed newspaper clippings, awards for science fairs long past. But I knew what I was looking for: Matthew Wells's file. I found it near the bottom of a drawer, tucked between two faded yearbooks. I opened it with trembling hands, and there it was. A single typewritten page. Sergeant Matthew Wells' commendation for acts of bravery during an undisclosed mission. No medals listed, no details, but enough to know there was more to the story than anyone had ever bothered to ask. I felt a fire build in my chest. Ethan deserved to know. The world deserved to know. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found his name: Robert Miller. We'd gone to college together. He'd served overseas, and he'd come home changed, quiet, like Matthew Wells had been. But if anyone could help, it was him. I pressed call, my thumb shaking on the screen. He answered on the second ring. "Nora," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Robert," I breathed. "I need your help." He listened as I told him everything. About the jacket, about the boys, about the silence Ethan carried like a burden. Robert didn't hesitate. "Send me the file," he said. "I'll be there by morning." I hung up and stood in that cold basement, the weight of the file in my hands. Upstairs, the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day. But for Ethan, the real test was just beginning. The next morning, the school buzzed with whispers. Ethan had been called to the principal's office first thing. Lucas and his friends walked in like they owned the place, smug smiles plastered on their faces. I stood in the hallway, watching them disappear behind the heavy wooden door. A knot twisted in my stomach. I knew what was happening in there. The principal's office wasn't a place for justice, not when the families of boys like Lucas paid for new computers and shiny football uniforms. Ethan sat across from Principal Harris, his jacket still clutched tight around him. I could only imagine the words being thrown at him. Apologize, disruptive, unacceptable behavior. And Ethan, silent as ever. But silence has its own kind of power. I saw it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes never wavered. Even when Harris's voice rose, he wouldn't bend. Not this time. Not for them. I stood outside that office, my fists clenched at my sides. Because sometimes, the hardest thing to do is stand still when everything in you is screaming to run. I told myself to wait, to trust the promise I'd made to Robert Miller, because I knew he was already on his way, and I knew he wouldn't let Ethan face this alone. Not anymore. The door to the principal's office swung open, and the hush in the room was immediate. All heads turned, conversations frozen in mid-breath. Outside, I saw them two black SUVs idling at the curb, engines low and steady like a distant drum. From the first SUV stepped a man I recognized even before he spoke. Robert Miller, dressed in his army dress blues, medals gleaming softly against the dark wool. Beside him walked another officer, older and even taller, his presence commanding the room without a word. They stepped into the office with a quiet gravity, the soft click of polished shoes against the tile like a heartbeat. Ethan looked up from where he sat, that battered jacket clutched in his hands. For a moment, he didn't seem to breathe. Neither did I. Principal Harris stammered to his feet, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Lucas and his friends went pale, their bravado crumbling under the weight of those uniforms. But Robert didn't look at them. He walked straight to Ethan. He placed one steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice was low and warm. "You don't have to sign anything today, son," he said. Ethan's eyes widened, tears pooling but not yet falling. "This jacket," Robert continued, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. "It isn't a relic. It isn't a costume. It's a legacy. He turned to Principal Harris, his expression calm but unyielding. Sergeant Matthew Wells was a soldier who gave more than most men could ever understand, Robert said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of something long buried. He saved lives, lives like mine, and he did it without the hope of a medal or the need for praise. Silence held the room like a closed fist. I felt my breath catch, the truth of his words sinking into every corner of that office. Robert reached into the pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but still carefully kept. He held it out to Ethan, and the boy took it with trembling fingers. "It's a letter your father wrote," Robert said. "He wrote it for you when you were only a year old, in case he never made it back." Ethan unfolded it slowly, his lips moving soundlessly as he read. I couldn't see the words, but I saw the way his shoulders straightened, the way his breath shuddered out of him like a prayer. His father's words, finally spoken after all these years. And in that moment, I knew no apology in the world could have meant more. Principal Harris cleared his throat, but his voice was small now, hesitant. "Colonel Miller," with all due respect, Robert's gaze cut him off. "This boy will not be forced to apologize for honoring his father," he said, each syllable like a quiet promise. Lucas shifted uneasily in his chair, his earlier smirk gone like smoke in the wind. Brady and Chase stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Robert turned back to Ethan, his expression softening. "Your father was a man of quiet courage," he said. "He never wanted medals. He never wanted to be remembered with parades or speeches, but he wanted you to know. He was proud to wear that jacket, and you should be now." Ethan's tears finally fell, silent streaks down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't hide them. And for the first time, I saw the full measure of his father's strength alive in him. He clutched that jacket like a lifeline, fingers pressing into the worn fabric as if to say, "I will never let this go." I felt a shiver run through me, a tear slipping down my own cheek before I could stop it. Because Ethan wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for every quiet act of service that never got its due. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder again, steady and sure. "Your father may not have had a medal," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, "but he had the respect of every man who served beside him." Ethan nodded, his chin high, even as the tears kept coming. "I know," he said softly. "I know." And in that simple phrase, there was a power no piece of paper could ever erase. Principal Harris shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, his authority suddenly small in the presence of that truth. "I believe this meeting is over," Robert said, turning back to the principal with quiet finality. Harris swallowed, then gave a stiff nod. Ethan stood, the letter pressed to his chest, that jacket around his shoulders like a second skin. He didn't look at Lucas or his friends as he walked out of the office. He didn't have to. They were already smaller than they'd ever been. I followed them into the hallway, my heart pounding, each step feeling like a step into something brighter. The air outside was cold, the sun a pale disk behind winter clouds, but Ethan didn't seem to feel the chill. He held his head high, his shoulders back, the jacket settling around him like a banner. And in that moment, the quiet weight of his father's memory was no longer a burden. It was a mantle, a testament to the man who had given everything. I watched as Robert and the other officer walked beside him, their steps in perfect unison, a silent honor guard for the boy who carried more than just a name. In the soft winter light, Ethan turned his face up to the sky, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. Not the kind you wear on your sleeve for the world to see, the kind that lives in the spaces between breaths, in the heartbeat of a memory that will never fade. I took a deep breath and let it out slow, because I knew in that instant that Ethan Wells would never again have to apologize for the man his father had been, or the boy he had become. Not while there was someone left to remember, not while there was someone willing to stand with him, not while the truth of what really mattered was written in the quiet, steady beat of a father's letter, and in the unbreakable bond of a jacket worn with honor. Ethan stepped out of the principal's office, the weight of that forced apology slipping from his shoulders. Robert and the other officer flanked him, calm and steady, their presence a quiet shield against any last words that might have been thrown his way. I fell in step beside them, feeling the finality in every footstep. Principal Harris stood behind his desk, his eyes avoiding Ethan's. The silence in that room was thick, but it was the silence of something broken and reformed, not something lost. Lucas and his friends slouched in their chairs, their laughter gone, their eyes dropped to the scuffed tile floor. For the first time, they saw Ethan not as a target, but as something they couldn't define or diminish. Ethan didn't look at them. He didn't have to. The hallway outside the office was empty, the echoes of our steps the only sound. The morning sun pushed through the high windows, laying stripes of light across the faded linoleum. Ethan's jacket caught that light, the frayed seams glowing softly in the quiet. I watched him lift his chin, just a fraction, and in that small movement, I saw the truth. This boy would never be small again. We walked out into the open air, the cold biting at our cheeks, but Ethan didn't seem to notice. The jacket flapped gently at his sides, like a small, defiant flag. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low but strong. "You're not alone." "Ethan," he said. "Not now, not ever." Ethan just nodded, his fingers brushing the edges of his father's letter in his pocket. The jacket settled around him, warm despite the winter chill, and I could see it in his face. This was more than fabric. This was a promise kept. As we walked across the frozen grass, other students watched from the windows. Whispers started to spread, hushed at first, but then growing. Some turned away, but others watched with wide eyes, seeing Ethan in a way they never had before. Not the odd boy with the old jacket, not the quiet one at the back of the room, but a boy who carried something bigger than any of us, a legacy, a name, a quiet kind of courage. By the time we reached the front steps, the murmur of voices had followed us. Ethan paused, turning to look back at the school that had tried to bend him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His silence was no longer a shield, it was a statement, a declaration of who he was and who he would always be. Robert stood beside him, his posture proud, the medals on his chest catching the pale winter light. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Ethan took a slow breath and stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frost-bitten ground. The jacket moved with him, every step a quiet echo of the man who'd worn it first. And as he walked, I realized this was how we honor those who came before. Not with parades or speeches, but with small acts of defiance, with the refusal to bow our heads, even when the weight feels too much to bear. News of what happened spread through the school by lunch. Whispers turned to stories, and stories turned to something bigger. In the cafeteria, I heard snippets of conversation. "Did you hear Colonel Miller came for Ethan? His dad was a real hero. You know, he didn't even sign the paper." I saw the shift in their eyes, the way they looked at Ethan's empty seat, and then at the jacket slung over the back of his chair when he returned. No one called him names that afternoon. No one laughed or pointed. Some offered small smiles, unsure but genuine. Others just looked down, ashamed of what they'd once believed. In the library, I saw a girl trace the name Matthew Wells on the back of a yearbook, her fingers gentle, reverent. In the hallway, I watched a boy adjust the cap on his head, as if to stand a little taller. Little things, small, but enough. At the end of the day, Ethan walked out of school with his head held high. The jacket hugged his frame, the cuffs still too long, but he wore it like it was made for him. Robert and I followed a step behind, our own breaths fogging in the cold. He glanced at me, his eyes warm. "Thank you," he said quietly. I shook my head. "It wasn't me." I said, "It was him. It was always him." We paused at the flagpole, the stars and stripes snapping in the sharp wind. Ethan looked up at it, his face calm, the last of the day's sun catching the edge of his father's name sewn into the jacket. And in that light, I saw it clear as day. Honor isn't found in medals. It's in the quiet spaces between words, in the way we choose to stand, in the way we refuse to let the world tell us who we are. As Ethan turned to leave, I let out a slow breath, my chest tight with something that felt a lot like pride. He walked down those steps, the jacket moving with him, every thread a story, every worn patch a testament. And in that simple, steady walk, I knew this. There are heroes who never need a medal, who never need a stage, just a reason to stand tall when the world would rather see them bent. Ethan Wells was one of those heroes. And in his silence, I heard the loudest truth of all, that dignity doesn't come from what others give you. It lives in every breath you take, every quiet act of courage. It's stitched into the fabric of an old jacket, and in the heart of a boy who knows exactly who he is, even if the world takes its time to catch up. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.